Welcome back to the Stoneham Public Library's Book Service Podcast. Today is Monday, which means that we'll be investigating real-life murder mysteries. In this episode, we have 5 cases that come straight from Stoneham, Massachusetts. Join us as we delve into some hometown homicide history. Possibly the first murder in Stoneham's history was that of Jacob Gould. The initial account, written by Reverend James W. Poland and published in the 1843 edition of the Farmer's Monthly Visitor, has allured many a local historian. In fact, Silas Deane, followed by William B. Stevens, both among Stoneham's great chroniclers of the past, have borrowed many details of the events at the Gould family farm. It was the middle of autumn 1819 when a man named Daniels came to Stoneham, Massachusetts. Having just gotten out of prison, he was already looking for money to steal. Before he was turned loose back into society, Dalton, a former Stoneham resident and current inmate at the Charlestown State Prison, had tipped him off about a wealthy local family that could satisfy Daniel's desires. He would be looking for a farm on Pond Street, which runs across the south side of town. The place belonged to members of the Gould family, one of Stoneham's oldest, with ancestors that settled there as early as the late 17th century. That afternoon, as he was slithering along Pond Street, he stopped 2 boys and asked them to tell him about the Gould family. His main question was, did they have money? They sure did. It was a well-known fact that the Goulds were richer than most Stoneham residents at the time. On top of that, the family had a penchant for hoarding its money. But despite their miserly ways, they were far from being known as bad folks. They didn't lie to or cheat anyone in any way. The Goulds had a good reputation with the townspeople. These were the things that Daniels loved to hear. People with lots of money, yet are kind enough to be easily disarmed. 2 weeks later, on Friday, November 25th, David Gould and his sister Polly were at the family farm, settling in for the night. Their brother, Jacob, had gone into town to buy a bottle of rum. He planned to kill some hogs the next day and wanted to provide compensation for the men who were going to help him do it. The family's hired help, a widow named Mrs. Winship, was also milling about in the house. While Jacob was running his errand, David and Polly noticed that Mrs. Winship was exhibiting rather unusual behavior. Not unusual in general, but unusual for her character. She would repeatedly glance at her watch, which she never did. She also stepped outside at least twice, as if she were waiting for something, or expecting someone to arrive. Someone other than Jacob Gould. Jacob returned home with his rum sometime between 8 and 9 o'clock. He lit a fire in the hearth, then sat down at table and made a cocktail for himself, which he started to sip slowly. His supper was interrupted, however, when a trio of menacing figures stalked into the room and stood over him. Instead of masks, their faces were blackened with soot, and each man was brandishing a dagger in his hand. Jacob thought it was peculiar that 3 burly, heavy-set men had entered the house without making a sound. That would have been difficult, if not impossible to do, unless someone in the home had opened one of the doors and let them in. The 4 occupants of the room remained silent for what felt like eternity. Suddenly, the visitors descended upon Jacob, demanding that he give them his money. Still sober enough to react accordingly, he sprang up, grabbed his chair, and swung it around wildly to keep the intruders at bay. But he was outnumbered. The men stabbed him multiple times in various parts of his body, one of the blades having pierced his chest, and very likely went right into his heart. When a frightened, adrenaline-driven David entered the scene, he overlooked an axe in the corner of the room, and instead took up a wooden plank. He rushed Jacob's assailants, but fell in the struggle, sustaining stab wounds in the abdomen, left shoulder blade, and part of his left arm, which he had raised to block a knife point from going deep into his chest. With Jacob and David out of commission, the 3 attackers rounded up the 3 Gould siblings, as well as Mrs. Winship, and bound them tightly with rough cords that broke the skin of their wrists. A 4th man, whose name was thought to be Clefton, a former Stoneham resident with an unsavory past, kept watch by the front door, lest a neighbor catch sight of the events that were unfolding at the Gould farm. Meanwhile, the thieves ordered the Gould siblings, one by one, to lead them upstairs, where they hid their money. Polly went first, while the men followed with a kerosene lantern to light the way. As they ascended the steps, the flame had gone out. Now that the stairway was darkened, and the men were preoccupied with relighting their lantern, Polly took advantage of the situation by lashing out at her captors. Although they regained control, and her hands badly cut, Polly's resistance was not in vain. One of the men suffered a slash across his finger, which was bleeding profusely, and would probably cause a scar. Finally, the thieves were able to force the Goulds to hand over their cash. David's savings totaled to about $200 in silver and gold, or a little over $5,000 today. Polly's, about $800 in silver and gold, now over $20,000, and Jacob's, a measly $5 bill, a sign that he liked to throw around his money. Now that they had gotten what they came for, the thieves threw the Goulds and Mrs. Winship down into the cellar. After barring the door with a table, the men passed around Jacob's bottle of rum as they divvied up the loot amongst themselves. On their way out the door, the thieves threatened the Goulds with death if any of them tried to escape. 3 of the men fled, while one of them stayed behind to act as lookout. The 4 captives stayed quiet in their basement prison for some time. But as the night wore on, Jacob's condition worsened, and his groans of agony became too heart-wrenching to listen to. At around 11 o'clock, David decided that he had had enough of his brother's pain. He somehow snuck out and sought refuge at a neighbor's house, where he notified the police. At around 3 a.m. on the morning of November 26th, Jacob had succumbed to the wound to his heart. His brother and sister survived, though battered and bloody. By daybreak, all of Stoneham was informed of the murder and robbery at Gould Farm. An inquest over Jacob's body was held as soon as David and Polly collected themselves. The hired help, Mrs. Winship, was also present. She was reported to have drank the rest of the rum straight from the bottle before her examination. She then allegedly refused to take the oath and had trouble looking the coroner in the eye when questioned. Several Stoneham residents suspected Mrs. Winship to have been an accomplice to the murderers. However, there was no solid evidence to prove her guilt, so she was never charged with any crime. Days later, David offered a $500 reward to anyone who could detect the criminals. John Brooks, the then governor of Massachusetts, added another $500 to the bounty. With this major monetary incentive, 3 different men had been apprehended around the same time. The first was identified as Daniels, who had been caught in the seaside city of Newport, Rhode Island. He had been accosted based on a few suspicious qualities about his person, namely, that he had a very visible cut on one of his fingers, as if he had been slashed with a knife, that his checkbook and some of his paper money had specks of blood on them, and that he was in possession of gold coins that matched the description of those that had been stolen from the Gould family. Daniels explained to the authorities that the cut on his finger had been caused by scraping the edge of a seashell that he skipped across the water on a nearby beach. To stop the bleeding, he wrapped some of his dollar bills around his finger and dabbed at his injury with some of the pages from his checkbook. As for the coins, he claimed to have gotten them from elsewhere. Unfortunately for Daniels, the police did not fall for his lies. The evidence to implicate him in the robbery and murder of Jacob Gould was all there. The cut, the blood, the coins. He was immediately brought to a jailhouse at Lechmere Point in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he would be committed to trial. It was at this time that 2 boys from Stoneham claimed to have been approached by an older man 2 weeks before the murder. They were consequently summoned to the Cambridge courthouse and were asked to identify the guilty party. Both boys, taken separately, had selected Daniels as the culprit and even divulged the nature of their conversation. Personal questions about the Gould family, especially in relation to their wealth. In light of the boys' testimonies, Daniels was jailed and committed to trial. However, he would never see that day, and justice would never be served in full. For before his trial took place, Daniels committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell. Some have remarked that this action was proof alone that Daniels was guilty, if not for the murder of Jacob Gould, then at least of stealing the family's money. A man named Phillips was the second man to be arrested by the police. He had been in a West Boston gambling house when someone suspected that the coins he was using had come from the Gould family. David and Polly were brought in to examine these coins, but because they were unable to determine whether the money belonged to them, and because they did not want to hang a possibly innocent man, Phillips was allowed to walk away scot-free. A third man was stopped by police in Portland, Maine, but was eventually let go without being formally arrested. After a brief conversation with the man, the authorities concluded that he was probably innocent. The years passed by, and nothing new about the theft and murder at the Gould farm had come to light. Apart from Daniels, no one else who had been associated with the group was ever caught, tried, and found guilty. The shady man known as Clefton did actually return to Stoneham some years afterwards, though David and Polly Gould avoided him out of fear of retribution. Clefton, for his part, kept mainly to himself. David died in 1834, and his sister Polly in 1836. Neither of them received closure on who exactly killed their brother. As for Mrs. Winship, the family's hired help, she passed away at an almshouse, or old age home, in Medford, Massachusetts, several years later. With all the witnesses dead, the perpetrators were free to live out their last days until they too met their ends, wherever they were and however they died. To this day, the event remains one of Stoneham's historic unsolved mysteries. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 11th, 1889, a boy who was driving a milk wagon discovered the body of a 20-year-old man just inside the gates of an old Stoneham cemetery. The boy stopped a local farmer who had been on the way to work that morning. The farmer, in turn, called the police. Thanks to some documentation found in the pocket of a muddy overcoat, the young man was identified as George Martin, Jr. He had sustained what appeared to be a stab wound, still bleeding, in the left side of his chest. Police Chief R.L. Newton arrived on the scene and brought the corpse to an undertaker, where Martin's body was looked at by 4 medical professionals and viewed by numerous Stoneham residents during the inquest. The first person to step forward was Martin's mother. If this had been murder, she didn't know of anyone who would have had a rivalry with her son. Martin was working sporadically at a local shoe factory. At the time, however, he had been out of a job. He apparently spent most of his free time traveling around the Boston area. In fact, he had recently returned from Brockton, though it was never disclosed as to what he had been doing there. Regarding recent events, Martin's mother told police that he stepped out the door the previous evening at around 7:45 p.m. and headed uptown. It was the last time that she saw her son alive. The second individual to come forward was Patrick Bishop, who introduced himself as a friend of Martin's. Bishop divulged to police that he and Martin had been at a bar on Montvale Avenue in the neighboring city of Woburn until about 11:15 the previous night. When they had had their fill of drink, the two of them boarded a horse car with a few other men around their age. The carriage went up Montvale Avenue, turned onto Main Street in Stoneham, and went through the square. The group disembarked at a place called Leeds Corner, somewhere near the junction of Main and Union Streets, where another group of men were gathered. One of those men was a fellow Stoneham resident named William McGuire. According to Bishop, as they all stood there talking, Martin and McGuire suddenly entered an altercation. Bishop would later testify in court that he had heard Martin say, "You can't down me, McGuire." Martin was then reported to have knocked McGuire down to the ground. McGuire then shouted for police, though this seems to have gone unheeded for some reason, despite Officer Wallace Houghton having been on duty in the area. Bishop admits that everyone present, including himself, had been filled with liquor, probably drunk. Understandably, he wanted to avoid getting into any trouble, either with McGuire or the police. In light of the situation becoming rowdier by the second, Bishop turned away from the crowd that was forming on the corner of Main and Union Streets and started for home. As he was passing St. Patrick's Parish Church, he looked back at Martin, who had managed to pull himself away from the debacle with McGuire. However, rather than following Bishop along Palmworth Street, Martin turned on to William Street, which runs perpendicular to Palmworth. From there, he crossed over to Pleasant Street. Bishop remained long enough to watch Martin reach the entrance of the old burying ground, which contains the graves of Stoneham's oldest residents. Thinking that Martin was deliberately taking the long way to where he lived in Washington Court, which is in the opposite direction of where he was headed, Bishop left his friend to it and strolled on homeward. Maybe Martin needed to walk some things off. By late afternoon on the day that Martin's body was found, the medical examiner and his assistants determined that Martin had indeed been stabbed in the left side of the chest with a very sharp instrument, most likely a knife. The doctors also located another less serious wound on the left thigh, though they were unable to account for whether it had been there before or after Martin's death. They were unsure as to why the murderer would have stabbed Martin in that area of the body, when a fatal injury to the heart was sufficient. Then again, the wound could have been inflicted by someone else. But if so, who did it? As a result of Bishop's testimony, William McGuire became a prime suspect in the death of George Martin. The police interviewed the 28-year-old McGuire, who presented himself as a pleasant, well-dressed, and well-spoken young man. Writers for the Stoneham Independent would later quote his co-workers as describing him as highly respectable, quiet, gentlemanly, and industrious. McGuire said that he knew Martin only as a casual acquaintance, nothing more. He denied having any sort of fight with Martin, and claimed that he learned of Martin's death just hours earlier. It is possible, however, that his lack of memory could have been forgetfulness due to excessive alcohol consumption. The only questionable thing that police found about McGuire was the fact that he lived on the Stoneham side of Montvale Avenue. If Bishop's account is true, then why would McGuire have taken a horse car that transported him up the hill beyond his house? McGuire responded by saying that he stayed in the car because it did not stop on its route before the hill. He wanted to wait until the next official stop, which happened to be at Leeds Corner. There, he got out of the car, but he didn't immediately walk straight home. For reasons unknown, he remained at the corner of Main and Union Streets. Well after 11 o'clock, George Martin and Patrick Bishop showed up. That's when trouble ensued. After his interview, the police took McGuire to the station under the suspicion that he was Martin's murderer. Now, here's where the plot thickens. One of Martin's brothers was interviewed by a writer for the Stoneham Independent later that week. He told the newspaper that his brother and McGuire were never on very good terms, although they had been in each other's company on several occasions. This subtle hostility seems to have contributed, at least partly, to the Saturday night debacle between Martin and McGuire. Also, when police went to search McGuire's house for the knife that may have been used in Martin's murder, McGuire's wife disclosed that her husband did in fact own at least 2 knives of some kind. She even brought one out and showed it to the police, saying that McGuire had had it with him that night. But when police approached McGuire about this, he explained that he took his other knife when he went out. He then claimed to have lost it 3 or 4 days prior to Martin's death, which is why he was unable to produce it during his interrogation. Could McGuire have taken his petty, yet deadly revenge on Martin, then quickly disposed of the knife? Possibly, but how? It is unclear how extensively the police searched for this knife, and whether they had ever thought to look in Spot Pond, or any of the other bodies of water in the area, for that matter. The trial of William McGuire was held in the Woburn District Courthouse on Saturday, October 19th, 1889. It was documented by the Stoneham Independent as was the account of Patrick Bishop, from whom we have obtained many of the details of the night that George Martin took his last walk home. Despite testimonies given by Bishop, Officer Houghton, McGuire, and other witnesses, as well as their consequent cross-examinations, the proceedings were inconclusive. As a result, the judge ordered that the trial be taken up by a superior criminal court. According to the Independent, which published a notice about this case the following month, William McGuire was arraigned in an East Cambridge courthouse, where he pled guilty to the charge of having killed George Martin. That judge, having considered the alcohol-induced circumstances and the defendant's apparent good behavior, he sentenced McGuire to only 4 years of prison. Throughout this case, I found it interesting that William McGuire had been arrested, tried, and imprisoned, despite the fact that the prosecution never produced the supposed murder weapon. The condemnation of McGuire seems to have been based mostly on circumstantial evidence, such as rumors and theories, but no one ever asked to see the knife before coming to a conclusion. I wonder, then, if McGuire pled guilty not because he committed murder, but because his lawyer had pressured him to do so, perhaps to get a shorter sentence. Yet, if McGuire really was innocent, then the question would still stand. Who killed George Martin? On November 9th, 1934, Gordon Marston penned a front-page article in the Stoneham Independent about the death of an entire family that took place the night before. He called it the worst crime in the history of Stoneham, which it certainly was at that time, and may very well still be unsurpassed as such, almost 100 years later. Due to its violent nature, I would suggest to listeners who dislike hearing about graphic details of suicide and murder, as well as severe mental illness, to skip ahead to the next story. This case gets pretty brutal. It was late in the afternoon of November 8th, 1934, when Sergeant John O'Brien and Patrolman Robert Bradley of the Stoneham Police Department arrived at 58 Wright Street. The multi-family apartment building was positioned on top of an embankment, which gave it a dark, looming presence. A call from a concerned relative of one of the tenants directed them to the 3rd floor of the house. When Sergeant O'Brien and Patrolman Bradley gained entrance into the unit, they made a horrifying discovery. All 4 members of the Lindquist family were dead. Joel Lindquist was hanging from a light fixture in a bedroom with a belt around his neck, his feet dangling a few inches above a small sofa that lay overturned on the floor. Beyond the narrow doorway of the attic, his wife, Coroner, was found on the floor, strangled to death. Their 2-year-old daughter, Serenea, had been stabbed to death in her crib, while a 12-day-old infant son lay lifeless in a clothes basket, his state too abominable to describe. The 2 officers immediately called Captain J. Clarence Nelson to inspect the crime scene, and medical examiner Roscoe Purley to analyze the bodies. It became evident that Joel Lindquist murdered his family, then committed suicide, a conclusion that was drawn based on the positions of the Lindquists' bodies and the wounds they had sustained. Purley placed the time of death between 1:30 and 3 a.m. It was Captain Nelson, however, who had to figure out why the family died, a job that serves as the foundation for this gruesome case. As he probed the Lindquist's apartment for clues, Nelson came across some disturbing findings. Next to the woman's corpse were 2 knives, one a 7-inch blade, the other a short paring knife, which had been wrapped in a wad of paper that, according to Marston, bore an unprintable insinuation. The message had been written in blood. Seeking to identify some motive, some reason for these senseless acts of violence, Nelson searched the family's possessions. He soon found the key to unlocking the secrets of this mystery, the diary of Joel Lindquist. A glance at its pages revealed an individual who had been struggling to keep his sanity amidst a battle with suicidal thoughts, as well as the delusion that he was living, quite literally, in another world. A postcard and a letter were also found with Joel's belongings. Printed on the card was a brief, incoherent message, which read, "I killed the ones I loved. But why let innocent children suffer the horrible suffering life is filled with? Why wait until nature would? Would you think you are so smart? Figure this out if you can till electricity. Red human blood to you. The life has been a great adventure, just a dream. The death will be still another one." The letter, on the other hand, ran to 4 pages and contained more of Lindquist's wild ravings. Among these included the notion that he would die and be reborn 3 more times, as well as a claim that he had hidden millions of dollars in the form of gold and jewelry. Lindquist never indicates the location of these riches. Judging by some of the sentences written on the postcard, the note seems to have been addressed to someone specific. We can only but speculate that that someone may have been Coroner Lindquist. Nelson and his men suggested the chilling possibility that Joel had written the note and the letter at his desk in the attic, then called Coroner up to meet him, only to strangle her with the belt from his trousers. This would make her the first victim that night, perhaps symbolizing the reason for his rampage. Following the investigation, Nelson met with neighbors to learn more about the Lindquists and to get a better picture of the man who had slayed his whole family and, finally, himself. It turned out that the Lindquist family had moved to Stoneham from Brockton, Massachusetts, about 4 months previously. The young couple had been married for 4 years. It appeared to nearly everyone that both husband and wife were content in their marriage. Joel had been working the late shift at the now-defunct Atlantic Gelatin Factory on Hill Street in Woburn. Recently, however, his co-workers indicated that Lindquist had been expressing plans to commit suicide with increasing frequency. Furthermore, despite being only 27 years old, he was said to have been in poor health, though it is unclear what conditions he was suffering from, besides an unhealthy mental state. Joel Lindquist's history with mental illness is also unclear, or unknown. What had caused his psychosis? Had it developed gradually, or did it come on suddenly? The police theorized that Lindquist had been stirred by some jealousy regarding his wife's affections for another man. There is nothing, however, to support that Coroner was having any extramarital affairs. I find it most interesting that Joel's family never appears in this narrative. Perhaps they would have been able to speak on his behalf, to shed some light on his character and personality. The other families in the apartment never suspected anything wrong with the Lindquist family. Mrs. Blovelt, who lived with her husband William on the first floor, admitted that, Although she did not know Coroner Lindquist too well, she perceived Coroner to have been a loyal wife and devoted mother. The Robinsons, who lived on the second floor, had been fairly close to the Lindquists. 14-year-old Artis Robinson would often take Serenea Lindquist out for walks around the neighborhood. On November 8th, Artis had gone up to the third floor to see if her friend would come out for one of their customary strolls. When she received no answer, she tried the knob, but the door was locked. So she returned to her parents with a comment about the uncharacteristic silence that exuded from the Lindquist's unit. Artis's mother, Hattie, was reminded of a strange sound that she had heard the previous night, around 1:30 a.m., the sound of a large piece of furniture being moved. This may have been the moment when Joel Lindquist kicked away the sofa from under his feet, which enabled him to take his own life. Once Arthur Robinson came home from work, Hattie and Artis voiced their concerns about the Lindquist family. He decided to phone his friend Carl Segelberg, who was related to Coroner Lindquist. Segelberg also happened to live in Stoneham, so he went over to 58 Wright Street and knocked on the Lindquist's door. He, like Artis, received no answer, and the door was still locked. That's when he called the police, only for O'Brien and Bradley to stumble upon the aftermath. Today, the 3-story house at 58 Wright Street still stands tall. From the outside, one would never think that the place has a black spot in its history. However, I wonder how many of its newer tenants are made aware of the horror that took place on the 3rd floor all those years ago. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the night of February 17th, 1980, elderly Stoneham resident Dorothy Calton awoke to a noise that erupted somewhere in her house. As she went from room to room, she found the motionless body of her 77-year-old husband, Robert, slumped on the couch in the living room. Fearing that he had suffered a heart attack, Dorothy ran out the door and trudged barefoot in the snow to the house of her next-door neighbor, Kenneth Lockman. Dorothy led Kenneth back to her husband so that Kenneth could confirm his condition. However, when Dorothy turned on the lights, Kenneth noticed a large amount of blood issuing from Robert's body. Lockman then called the police, who rushed Calton to the hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival. The cause of death: severe blood loss due to multiple stab wounds. It had to be murder. But who would have killed an innocent old man in his own home? And for what purpose? A police inspection revealed that Robert Calton's wallet was missing. In the days following, detectives interviewed Calton's wife, Dorothy, as well as all of their neighbors. In describing Robert and Dorothy Calton, a friend of theirs is quoted as saying, "They were a very close, very devoted couple. They wouldn't hurt a fly." Some people were shocked, their statements giving the impression that something like murder was nearly inconceivable for this quiet neighborhood on Bow Street. In fact, one neighbor expressed apprehension and sleep troubles that stemmed from the break-in/murder. Other neighbors, though sympathetic to the tragedy, were not as surprised that this had happened. It turns out that Robert Calton had been a professional drummer in the Boston Musicians Union. He often bought, traded, and sold drum equipment to whoever wanted them, everyone from music store employees to curious customers just off the street. It is important to note that many of those transactions almost always took place at his house. Also, Calton had been a drum instructor and would host lessons, again, at his house. According to one neighbor, it was not unusual to see his students walk in the front door at odd hours of the day and night. Clearly, Robert Calton had had a lot of contact with many different kinds of people and granted many of them access to his home. Another noteworthy aspect of Calton's character is that, because he was frequently buying and selling expensive musical equipment, he always carried around a large sum of money. Some would say that he carried too much cash. One neighbor stated that he could be in possession of as much as $100 in his wallet at any time. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, Robert Calton was known to have been obsessive about domestic security. One observer likened Calton's house to a fortress, reporting that he had installed locks, deadbolts, and chains on every door, and even nailed the windows shut. Another person alleged that, on some occasions, Calton would even lock his wife inside the house when he left for the day. It is interesting how the police established that there were no signs of either a forced entry or that a struggle had taken place. These details could only point to one probability: that Calton knew his murderer. While the police learned all they could about Robert Calton, they were in the dark about the killer's identity. For a time, the leads went nowhere. But later that month, things started looking up for the law. Now, sources are a bit unclear as to the exact timeline and the ways in which these events played out, so I have tried to piece them together in what seems like a logical order. Back in December of 1979, Calton published advertisements in the Stoneham Independent where, over the course of several weeks, he announced that he was selling over $4,000 worth of drum equipment. He stamped these posts with an urgent message: "Owner needs cash, fast." Given this information, the police inferred that the murderer was someone who read and accepted at least one of Calton's articles. This narrowed the field tremendously. The investigation's first real breakthrough came from the handiwork of State Trooper Kenneth Palmer, a forensic photographer and fingerprint expert. After the murder, Palmer took a snare drum that had been near Calton's resting place on the couch and examined it for fingerprints. Lo and behold, 3 prints had been planted on the side of the drum: a left middle finger, a left ring finger, and a thumb. They matched those of a 22-year-old Woburn man named Robert Amico. Then there was the story of Richard McDonough, a Stoneham police officer who lived down the street from the Caltons. McDonough recalled how, at around 9:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, he was driving up Bow Street when he saw an unfamiliar car that was parked outside the Caltons' house. The vehicle was a light blue 1971 Oldsmobile Cutlass. McDonough said that the only reason he had noticed it was because the car had no rear license plate. Since he was off duty that evening, he shrugged off the infraction. He did not, however, forget the car. Weeks later, McDonough and Stoneham Inspector Thomas Taranti drove out to Robert Amico's house on Crescent Avenue in Woburn. There, parked in the driveway, was a light blue 1970s Oldsmobile Cutlass with no rear license plate. McDonough and Taranti ran the plate in front, only to discover that the car was owned by Robert's estranged wife, Sandra. Police eventually learned that, despite being separated, Robert and Sandra Amico continued to live together and were still in a relationship. But why had Amico used his wife's car to drive to Calton's house? why had he been in Calton's house to begin with? According to Stoneham Sergeant Detective Edward Penanto, Amico had bought drum equipment from Calton in the past. This makes sense. Calton and Amico knew each other, which is the only reason that Calton would have let Amico into his house. However, McDonough was uncertain if it was the same car. With only guesses and coincidences, the police didn't want to pull the trigger just yet. But soon enough, the nail in Amico's coffin came in May 1980. Stoneham Police Detective Robert Morera and State Police Detective Lieutenant Thomas Spartacino found that Amico had forged Calton's name on 2 credit card purchases at a gas station. Police also noticed that another name appeared on Calton's credit card purchases: Joseph Whiteman. Whiteman was a childhood friend of Amico's and worked at the gas station where Amico bought gas. After Amico's second trip to the station, Whiteman kept Calton's credit card for himself and proceeded to buy gas with it 5 times more. On May 31st, police staked out Amico's house while he was away. When he returned, they arrested him, bringing him first to the Woburn police with a warrant, and then jailed him at the Stoneham station. The police then went after Whiteman, but they eventually cleared him of any charges, as he claimed to have had nothing to do with the murder, and that he didn't know the card he was using had been Calton's. After some frustrating delays in court proceedings, the trial of Robert Amico took place on March 16, 1981. There and then, the plot of this real-life murder mystery was revealed. It was true that Amico had known Calton, that he had been in Calton's house at least once, and that he was in the habit of buying drum equipment from him. However, Amico contended that the last time he had seen Calton was January 15th, about a month before the murder. But what had he been doing at Calton's house on that day? The answer came from one of the key witnesses, Amico's estranged wife, Sandra. According to her, she sold her husband's drums to Calton for $400, then cashed the check that Calton gave her. When Amico found out, he and a friend went over to Calton's house on January 15th. That was the same day that a woman named Sharon Fraz, one of Calton's former students, had stopped by to visit with Dorothy. While Fraz and Dorothy were in the kitchen talking, 2 men came to the house, asking to see Calton. In court, Fraz described one of the visitors. She was then shown a set of photographs of 8 different men. She selected Amico out of the group. She was unable, however, to describe the man who had been with Amico that day. Amico did tell police that he had gone to Calton's house that day to renegotiate the drums his wife sold, as well as to play with Calton's drum set. But this second part appears to have been a lie. Nevertheless, it checks out that Amico was at Calton's house on January 15th, but could he have returned at a later date? The evidence seems to point in that direction. You will recall that State Trooper Kenneth Palmer checked for fingerprints on the snare drum that was next to Calton's body. Kenneth Yetman, the owner of a drum store in Boston, said that Calton purchased that drum on January 25th, well after the date that Amico supposedly saw Calton for the last time. A few days after that, Kenneth Lockman, the next-door neighbor, saw Calton cleaning the drum with solvent and a rag, which would have removed any fingerprints, including Amico's. Finally, Sandra Amico testified that, on February 17th, her husband had taken the keys to her car, very likely the same car that Officer McDonough saw outside Calton's house on the night of the murder, the light blue 1971 Oldsmobile Cutlass. We don't know how exactly that night's events transpired, but we can assume that Robert Amico drove to Calton's house under the pretense of getting a better sale on his drum equipment. Calton invited Amico, a familiar face, into his home, where the two went to the room where the drums were kept. Amico then stabbed Calton repeatedly while he was sitting on the couch. Such a casual position is interesting, especially for a man who, as far as we're concerned, was constantly on edge, even in his own house. It suggests that Calton was at ease, never suspecting that Amico held any ill intentions toward him. The trial ended with the 23-year-old Robert Amico being sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Robert Calton. According to the Stoneham Independent, Amico, upon hearing of his fate, burst into tears. As with the George Martin case, the murder weapon was never found, nor were Calton's wallet and credit card. Also, the man who had accompanied Amico to Calton's house was never identified. Could it have been Whiteman? Could he have lied to the police when he said that he was not Amico's accomplice in the murder? He was, after all, the last one to use Calton's credit card, a total of 5 times, before his arrest. Perhaps he knew more to the story than he let on. Decades later, we still don't know the answers to these questions, and likely will never know. This is a strange world we live in, one in which people kill for the sake of lesser goods. This case is reminiscent of the killing of Jacob Gould, in which the real motive was money, while murder had been collateral damage. It also serves as a lesson to be careful who you associate with and who you let into your home. One day in October of 1993, a security guard for the New England Memorial Hospital was patrolling the grounds when he stopped at a Saab that was parked in a secluded corner of the lot. With the help of the noontime sunlight, the guard peeked in through the window to see a woman in the back seat, bunched up under a blanket. From where he stood, she seemed to be sleeping, so he called out to her, but she remained unresponsive. That's when he notified the police. When they arrived, they pried open the door, which had been locked. Once they saw the woman up close, it was easy to tell that she was dead. There was no blood, however, nor were there any signs of a struggle. On the surface, it appeared that she had taken her own life. In a few days' time, authorities would discover that the woman was a 43-year-old doctor named Linda Goudey, who worked at the New England Memorial Hospital. She had been missing for nearly a week. Then came the autopsy report, which concluded that she died roughly 4 days before she was found, implying that she had been killed elsewhere, was laid to rest in her car, and covered in a blanket by her assailant. A medical examination showed wounds on over 20 areas of her body, especially the neck and throat. It was obvious that she had died of strangulation, and in such a way that hinted that she knew her murderer. News of the grim discovery soon made its way to the hospital staff. Just about everyone who worked or was a patient at the facility had nothing but favorable words for Dr. Linda Goudey. Described as dedicated, vivacious, and a bubbly personality, she was also known to have been athletic, vegetarian, and neither smoked nor drank alcohol. By all accounts, this was definitely not someone who would have suddenly committed suicide, nor someone who made enemies. Goudey's family and friends were stunned by her death. police were stumped in their investigation. Dr. Linda Goudey, or Lynn as her friends and colleagues called her, had been an obstetrician, and a very good one at that, specializing in helping women with high-risk pregnancies. As a sign of devotion to her job, she was said to have often worked late into the night. According to one of her closest colleagues, Dr. Suzanne Rothschild, Goudey had attended a lecture in hepatitis at the hospital a week prior, on the night of September 30th. Intrigued by the topic, she took copious notes and then probed the speaker's mind during the question and answer session. After the conference ended, Goudey navigated the long halls of the hospital to her office, where she dropped off her notebook at her desk, then headed to her car. It marked the last time that Linda Goudey was seen alive. In the months following, police dove deeper into Goudey's personal life, which lent several clues as to who her killer might have been. She had been in a 4-year relationship with Dr. Timothy Stryker, an endocrinologist who also worked at the hospital. It was well known that the two had been dating, and there was little wonder why. Both were ambitious, outgoing, leading successful medical careers at the same hospital. They read the same books and went to the movies together. They even had planned a vacation to the Caribbean in October. However, she opted out of the trip weeks earlier. Eyebrows were raised when, after she turned up dead, Stryker took the trip by himself. Why had Linda called off her travel plans at the last minute? According to a 48 Hours mystery episode, released in 2008 by CBS News, as the date of departure drew near, Goudey told everyone she knew, including Stryker, of a strange dream that impressed itself upon her. She was in a car, driving along the side of a mountain, when, suddenly, a plane appeared in the sky. She then watched helplessly as it flew straight into the mountain, causing her death in the dream. Interpreting this as a premonition that she would die if she went on the trip, Goudey was compelled to stay home. How bizarre it is that this dream held so much significance and carried the fatal inevitability of some ancient oracle's prophecy. We have touched on the idea that dreams can sometimes portend future events in a previous episode. For interested listeners, it was the story of the Isidore, which had been set to leave the coast of Maine when, in the days leading up to that time, members of the crew experienced vivid dreams that hinted at an ill-fated voyage. One of the sailors was so afraid that he quit the same day the ship left port. The ship ran aground the next morning, and everyone on board died in the accident. Because he was romantically involved with Goudey, it did not take long for Stryker to become a prime suspect. Given the violent nature of the crime, signs pointed to the likelihood that the murder was personal, suggesting that someone grew angry enough to want to strangle Goudey. According to 48 Hours, Linda's family and friends demonized Stryker, claiming that they observed him and Goudey arguing within weeks leading up to the Caribbean trip. Linda's friend, Lisa Zolot, elaborated that Goudey had grown tired of Stryker's inflexible, controlling personality and was looking to break off the relationship. The Stoneham Independent included a remark from Linda Goudey's ex-husband, Cliff Goudey, who blamed Dr. Tim Stryker for his failure to report Linda's disappearance. In his words, Stryker was the one person who could have pulled the alarm, and he didn't. On the other hand, Stryker's wife vouched for her husband, saying that he never became violent with her and was not unbearable. In addition, Stryker's sister Jean had fond memories of Linda, for whom she had worked at the hospital. As a result of the accusations made by Linda's family and friends, and this information winding up in the media, Stryker felt that he had to constantly defend his name from being branded a murderer. All the while, he continued to practice medicine, even giving lectures at the hospital, which was renamed the Boston Regional Medical Center in the late 1990s. By 1995, little progress was made in the investigation. The case had gone cold when no witnesses came forward. That is, if there really were any witnesses at all. Police had little physical evidence, apart from the clothes that Linda had been wearing on the night of September 30th. In fact, police had to thank none other than Tim Stryker himself for supplying this evidence. Sources point out that Stryker's unusual willingness to provide information and to assist in the investigation only solidified the police's suspicion of his involvement in Goudey's murder. For example, he was in possession of a jacket that either was or resembled the one that Linda had been wearing on her last night alive, despite the fact that Stryker claimed that not even he saw her that night. When authorities caught him on this apparent contradiction, he explained that Linda would leave her belongings at his apartment from time to time. But among the things that Linda left behind were personal notes that described injuries that she had sustained at the hands of Stryker. Things get more interesting when Stryker spoke to 48 Hours correspondent Richard Schlesinger, stating that Goudey, and not he, was often the aggressor in these encounters. He went on to cite one occasion when he insulted Goudey's intelligence, and in response, she started throwing several objects that were within reach. To de-escalate the situation, he tried to grab a hold of her. However, she supposedly just fell to the floor and bruised the skin around her ribs. In 1996, Linda's mother, Marguerite, sued Dr. Stryker for killing her daughter. Since Stryker was not legally held accountable for her death, her family had to fight an uphill battle. All he had to do was plead innocent, which he did. This battle was fought for 10 years when, finally, in 2006, Goudey's family was able to bring Stryker to court. There, he was examined and cross-examined, and at one point in the proceedings, Stryker entered a precarious position. With the passing of the years, he himself had always been the sole suspect in Dr. Linda Goudey's murder. No one else ever came even close to being considered as an alternative. By the look of things, he must be guilty. With the debts going up and the chips dwindling down, Stryker was fully aware that he had innocence to gain, but everything else to lose. His family, his house, his money, his career. He might just have to say goodbye to all that. Then, 9 months after the proceedings began, a saving grace came for Dr. Timothy Stryker. At that time, he came forward with an affidavit from a man named Craig Pisano, who contacted him out of the blue with an account of that fateful October night. In a cell phone conversation, Pisano described how he and his girlfriend were in the hospital parking lot that evening when he noticed that a Saab was parked close by. From his vantage point, the occupants of the vehicle were a tall, muscular, blonde-haired man and a woman. The two were arguing and looked as if their altercation was about to become physical. In his statement, Pisano emphasized that if the woman really was Linda Goudey, then the man she was with looked like a football player and could not possibly have been Tim Stryker. Finally, an eyewitness who could give enough details that point towards Stryker's innocence in the murder trial. This turn of events was a shock to the system and to Linda's family. However, the old adage, if it's too good to be true, then it probably is, rarely gets proved wrong. Right away, prosecutors smelled the fish on this very convenient, all too perfectly prepared dish that was set before the judge. According to 48 Hours, Pisano confessed to having fabricated his entire account, and that Stryker had put him up to it. Authorities soon found cell phone records showing that the correspondence between Stryker and Pisano went back months before Pisano's story came to light. It was Richard Chambers, a patient of Stryker's, who had set the doctor up with Pisano. In return for their dirty work, Chambers and Pisano would receive handsome monetary payments, as well as free prescription drugs. Luckily for them, once they admitted their participation in Stryker's scheme, the two accomplices were free to walk. In April 2009, Dr. Timothy Stryker was convicted of perjury and sentenced to 4 years in prison. It was not, of course, quite what Linda's family and friends were looking for. Their daughter, their sister, their friend had been killed, and they were still convinced that Stryker was the one who did it. They resolved to get that answer out of him. Eventually. Alas, that closure would never come, as the whole case would be shut, absolutely, and probably forever. In 2011, Dr. Timothy Stryker died of cancer, 2 years into his perjury sentence. It is interesting that, with all the evidence in his possession, Linda's jacket and other belongings, Stryker was never officially charged with her murder. Perhaps the most striking element in this case is the amount of trauma to Linda's body, neck, and throat. Wouldn't these wounds have left fingerprints to help police identify the killer? There also had to be prints on the steering wheel and on the blanket that was draped over Linda's body. They were surely a key factor in the Robert Calton murder case, which was a decade before this one, and even made the rest of the investigation that much easier. Yet, the mere mention of them in this case is oddly absent. Another considerable detail is that Linda had been missing for almost a week. No one had even seen her car until she was found in it, parked in the lot of a busy hospital in broad daylight. Whoever killed her had had access to her car and was able to keep Goudey's body and car out of view for so long. Once again, the only realistic candidate would have been Stryker. Lastly, what about Stryker's alibi? Where was he between September 30th and the day her body was found? These questions, let alone their answers, were never brought up in the police reports or the local newspaper. Was Dr. Timothy Stryker innocent, as he attested every chance he got, even to his last breath? Or was he guilty of the murder of Dr. Linda Goudey? There are at least two sides to every issue, and this one is no different. Linda's family tended to paint Stryker in a bad light, while his wife and sister found no fault in his character. It becomes a matter of asking oneself who to believe. Furthermore, with so many forensic gaps left unfilled and details left unexplained, I can't help but suspect that either someone wasn't doing their job or that there may have been something going on in higher places. What I mean is, was Linda Goudey's death simply the result of someone having lost his or her temper? Or was it something else, something more complicated? In the episode dealing with the Boston Regional Medical Center's history, scandals were uncovered after it closed in 1999 due to bankruptcy. the public discovered that the hospital's top administrative staff had, for years, been shifting funds under the table and into their personal bank accounts, buying mansions and taking costly vacations, all while the facility slowly became addled by layoffs and pay cuts until the money was all gone. That is as far as I will go in raising the conspiracy theory hypothesis, however. With the lack of hard evidence to support it, and without any legitimate witnesses of the murder, we would have nothing but endless speculation. The only fact that we have to go on is this: that someone murdered Linda Goudey, for reasons unclear or motives unknown, and that person, to this day, remains unidentified. So much for Stoneham being a sleepy small town where nothing ever happens. The 5 cases covered in this episode have shown the dark underside of a place that most people see as a relatively uneventful bedroom community. Although there are other murders that have taken place in Stoneham, I chose these because they represent the best of the worst in the town's history. A list of sources will be provided in the description below, which includes relevant Stoneham Independent articles, a link to James Poland's account of the Jacob Gould murder, and the transcript for the 48 Hours mystery episode on the Linda Goudey murder. I am interested in seeing what you think of these cases, and what conclusions you have come to, especially about the unsolved murder of Dr. Linda Goudey, because it is so close to our own time, and because of the mystery surrounding it. It is unfortunate that there is neither a definitive biography written about her, nor are there any books that have been published about the murder. I wonder if anyone listening actually worked at the Boston Regional Medical Center, or had personally known and worked with Dr. Linda Goudey. Perhaps, in sharing your memories, you could shed some light on what really went on within the 4 walls and behind the closed doors of that hospital. That concludes another episode of the Book Service Podcast, brought to you by the Stoneham Public Library. As always, thanks for listening, and keep on reading.